people have joined because they want to hear about this subject. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you for sharing on your social media platform. We have people who just want to hear you. And so wherever you are now, I just want to say to our audience that the second session has begun. So wherever you are, the music break is over. It's time to continue this session. This is EdVest Catalyst 2020. Our focus is on reinvent. We're talking about how to lead, in a tough economy. And this discussion is going to be about neuroleadership. And we're so honored to have with us today a best-selling author, the best-selling author of Further, Faster, and the chief catalyst at Catalyst Growth Advisor. Bill is here already. Thank you so much, Bill. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much for having me, Tammy. I'm very happy to be here. I have a slideshow, but before I do that, I just wanted to say that I sort of already feel connected. I am from a family or generations of teachers and administrators in education, going back to my grandmother and all the way to my sister. So when Dimeji asked me to be part of this, I was very pleased to be able to do that. So what I'll do is let me share my screen and I will start my presentation, if that works. All right. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so let's talk a little about neuroleadership. First, what is it? And as you can see by the subtitle, I like to think of it as it's leading or learning with the brain in mind. Most of what we do as leaders sometimes inadvertently triggers things in the brain that we're unaware of. So if you have a small instance of what the brain is, understand at least at a high level how it works, because it often doesn't work the way we think it does. And there's a great quote that I love from an author that I enjoy. His name is Bill Bryson, and I love virtual, so I can read to you what the quote is. It says, "The great paradox of the brain is that everything you know about the world is provided to you by an organ that has itself never seen the world. It exists in silence and darkness, like a dungeoned prisoner. It has no pain receptors, literally no feelings. It has never felt warm sunshine or a soft breeze. To your brain, the world is just a stream of electrical pulses, like taps of Morse code. Out of this bare and neutral information it creates for you, quite literally creates a vibrant, three-dimensional, sensually engaging universe. The brain is you. Everything else is just plumbing and scaffolding." And that's really what I really enjoy about neuroleadership and why I want to be part of this and so happy to do it, is that when you combine neuroscience and leadership, you have a better experience for yourself and for your team and for your students in the education world. So let's first talk about the difference between what I mean by leadership. If you look up leadership in the dictionary, it says it's this action of you leading other people, which I think doesn't do it justice. If you're a really good leader, I believe you have an ability to attract followers, to join and assist you in getting wherever it is that you'd like to lead them. There's a premise here by some researchers in the leadership world that says that there's really no such thing as leadership. It's different for everybody, but the one thing that they all have in common is followers, and understanding that you're trying to create an environment where people want to follow you. They want to go where you want to bring them. And then you combine that with the brain and understanding of the brain, then you can really understand how to lead with the brain in mind. So what I'm going to do is a couple of things today. But based on the comments that I got from Dimeji and the team, I'm going to go in a certain order. But the first thing I want you to do, if you're out there, is just, if you have some way to write this down or type it into something, if you knew a few key things that would ultimately accelerate joyful learning, what would that mean to you? I believe the premise of education, no matter where you are, is really the end user is the student. And if you can create an environment of joyful learning, you'll better prepare them for what they will meet or able to meet in the world. So if you could do that, if you could find a few key things that would ultimately accelerate joyful learning, what would that be? So write that down in front of you and just sort of keep it in mind as we go through this. Timmy gave me a quick intro. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but basically what this means is I've done a lot of stuff. I have gray hair, as you guys can see, so I've been around. I've made a lot of mistakes, but primarily I've done a lot of startups in my day, and now I'm a coach. I coach generally small to medium-sized organizations. And I do speak around the country in different organizations, et cetera. And as Timmy was very nice to say, I have written a book. I also do a lot of blog posts and things. And I'll give you my URL at the end of the talk. So you can, if you like what I had to say here and want to hear more from me, I do put something out twice a month. And it's very short blog posts. So let's get into the agenda a little bit. First is from a lot of the feedback, because we're in this really unusual situation with COVID. Crisis is something that we should absolutely understand, and crisis affects the brain in a very specific way, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. Also, I'm going to talk about what is an optimal leading or learning environment, at least from the research that I know, and I have some certificates in neuroscience and that kind of stuff. I'm not a neuroscientist in any way, shape, or form, but I've been studying it for about 15 years. And then I'm going to talk about a lot about how I learned, how the brain actually learns. And it doesn't have any resemblance to how I was taught as a child, where you sit in a classroom and someone speaks to you and you're supposed to remember it and then give it back later. That's actually not the most effective way to help people absorb, retain, and then recall information. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So let's talk a little about crisis in the brain. The brain itself is a prediction engine more than anything. And how it does that, it gets information from the outside world and from inside the body, the heart, the lungs, the feet, the hands, everything. And when it's in crisis, that sensory information is at a heightened level. So what's interesting about what we're in today is the entire world has this heightened sensory level, which means you're probably not your best self. You may be a little impatient. You may forget stuff that you probably wouldn't have forgotten before because your brain is preoccupied with this sort of threat that's all around us. And then, of course, that creates higher stress and anxiety. We all have different levels of anxiety. There's a saying that we're all experiencing COVID. It's just unevenly distributed. So we're all experiencing it in a slightly different way. And when you have sustained stress, so over here in the US, we're about 3 months. I really haven't left my house much in the last 3 months. So sustained stress affects focus, attention, and productivity, which if you're leading a team, those are three really important things. And of course, if you're a teacher, they're essential to making sure that whatever you're trying to teach them, they're able to learn. And if focus is an issue and attention, that certainly affects productivity. So that's the world we're living in right now and for the foreseeable future, as far as we can tell. So let's talk about those threat levels. There are generally three different types of threat levels that we're all experiencing at any time. And level one is the broader environment. And that's our normal. So whatever your level is, we adjust. If you're in a a lot of activity or high stress environment, that becomes the normal. And that feels regular. And generally, our brain works pretty well in that environment. It's probably at its best, or its best capability at that moment. But then, of course, there's the threat of around you. So you've got sort of the broader environment, and you've got the neighborhood, something nearby. And I have a good friend who lives just outside of Minnesota. And if you guys following what's going on in the U.S. in terms of racism and social injustice, but it started in this place called Minnesota, and he is about 10 blocks away. So he's about a half a mile away, and he's starting to feel a little uncomfortable because he doesn't know what's going to happen to his home. So that's sort of that neighborhood threat that starts to feel a little more real, and that starts to slow down our ability to think. And so it puts a little more cognitive load on our brain. And then lastly, if it's upon you, this is fight, flight, or freeze. It's just you're in a situation where the threat is right there, and your brain doesn't really work at all very well. It's really just trying to figure out how to survive, like how to run away or freeze or whatever it might be. And those are sort of the three levels that people are in today. And if you'd like, you can do this with yourself right now, or you can certainly do it with your team or your students. And you can ask them what level are they at. And that will give you a better sense of where each individual is, because everyone's going to be in a different place. I ask this question of my clients all the time, and I get varying answers. So it really depends on how it affects you, etc. And that's going to help you as a leader to understand maybe why this person isn't themselves, or why they're a little short or distracted. And you can understand that. And there are things that you can do. So you can help as a leader put people into what are called positive state strategies. So maybe you can move them up to another number, or at least lessen the impact of the number that they're on. And those positive state strategies are around certainty. The brain does not like uncertainty, and we're in extremely uncertain times, unprecedented times in terms of at least the last century or so. And you as a leader can help them by creating a daily routine. One of the things that I do with my clients, I recommend highly, is that you do something called a daily huddle. You can certainly do this with your team. You can also do it with your students if you want. You know, at the beginning of every class or beginning of the day, you have a daily routine that you go through. In terms of a daily huddle with your own team, you can do, it's a very simple 5-minute, maybe depending on the size of your team, 5 or 10 minute set of things that you go through. One is, I usually do good news to start, but these days I do a check-in, because good news isn't usually something that's a lot of people aren't having right now. They're worried. So I do a check-in and ask them on a scale of 1 to 5, how are they? 5 is, I'm doing really well, you know, considering everything going on, things are going pretty well. My family's safe, I'm safe, I have a job, all those kinds of things. To a 1 where you're just, you know, you're not able to function very well. And so you can start with that. Then what you can do is say, okay, if our team, how are you doing in your, whatever your role is in the team? Maybe there's a metric that you're measuring them by. How are they doing on that? And then most importantly, on the next 2, which is, what is the most important thing you're getting done today? And then, are you stuck on anything that I can help? And this meeting is not a meeting that you have any discussion. It's just a status meeting. No one should be speaking for more than 60 or 90 seconds. And that's something you can do as an idea that gives people some level of certainty. And if you do it every day, it'll be something to look forward to, especially if you're doing good news. People like hearing good news from other people. They don't want to feel like they're alone, especially today. So that can certainly help. The other thing you do is give them choices. We as human beings, especially in Western culture, we like autonomy. We like to have a sense of control, or feel like we have control. We don't like being told what to do. And the example I give, at least here in the United States, is there are a bunch of people who just won't wear masks out in public, even though they've been advised and suggested, et cetera, but they weren't given a choice. They were told, wear a mask, and they just rejected it outright. You know, you're not going to tell me what to do. You can't control my life. And they're just sort of making it as a statement. So you can give them choice. You could certainly say something like, you know, there are lots of ways that you can protect yourself and others. One is wearing a mask. There could be other ways that you could come up with as well. Maybe there's you wear a shield, or maybe you try to stay at a great distance. Whatever you like to do, this is how you can help the society in general. And most people want to be part of something bigger than themselves and feel like they're contributing. So you can do that with your team as well. Give them some sort of control. And then lastly, create a sense of community or relatedness. Again, this is something that has happened over the last 3 or 4 months, and pretty much 7 billion people are experiencing the exact same thing at the exact same time. So that can be a reason to bring people together, to say, you know, we're in this together. Again, it's unevenly distributed. We're all feeling it differently, but we're all doing it together. If you can sort of find a reason to have some level of community around that. I recommend for my teams to do a couple of things. One is, if you're working from home and you're in a situation where you're not in a classroom or you know, needed somewhere else, like 2 or 3 hours in the day, just have everyone get on a Zoom call, or if you can do that, or Skype, or whatever your ability to get together is, and just leave it open. And you can just sort of hang out together and do your work. And once in a while, you can sort of raise your hand and say, hey, you know, Bill, I have a question. Maybe we can go offline and do it. The other thing that you can do is potentially, again, if you're in a virtual environment, you can have a situation where you meet at the end of the day once a week, and you just hang out for an hour, or you listen to great music like we just did. and you just relax, and it's something that they get to look forward to. So those are 3 things that you can do. You can certainly put your own spin on it. I'm sure there are a lot of educators that are extremely creative people. Again, my mother was a teacher. My grandmother was headed up the cafeteria. My sister was a teacher. So I certainly have been around that a lot. There's a lot of creativity born out of that. So when we get to neuroleadership and you're a leader, one of the most important things that you have to remember, I believe, is that it's much more about questions than it is about answers. And this is a great quote I love from a book called A More Beautiful Question, which is: a beautiful question is an ambitious yet actionable question that can begin to shift the way we think about something, and they might serve as a catalyst to bring about change. I certainly thought that was appropriate for, one, the name of my company, and of course, the name of the event that we're at today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some things around some questions. So I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things. One is I'm going to ask you 2 questions, one now, and then one I'm going to ask later, but I'm going to prime you with it now, and then I'll bring it up again later. The first one is, when you were in what I would call a learning groove, meaning you were learning something and you were engaged in it, it was working really well for you, you felt like you were actually learning something. What is the one word to describe how you felt? What was that environment that you were in that sort of allowed that to happen? So think about that. I'll ask you in just a second, and I'll give you mine as well. But just one word. What's one word that sort of comes to mind when you were in the learning groove? And then the second question, which again we'll come back to in a little bit, is think about something complicated that you know or know how to do extremely well. It can be anything you want. It can be something that you cook. It can be something around sports. It could be something in your church. It doesn't matter. But it was probably something that took a little effort to learn. But now you know how to do it really well. You might have it completely memorized, or you can do it without even thinking anymore. Whatever that was. I've been taught by people how to cook a Roma tomato a certain way, how to roast it. I've been taught how to kite surf. I've been taught how to do Morse code, all these wonderful things. So what was that process that you went through to get to mastery? If you sort of think about that. So I'll plant that in the back of your brain now, but let's get back to the first question. So when you were in this learning groove, what is the one word to describe how you felt? So my word is safe. When you are a leader, or again, a teacher, and you want to help people to learn something, you need to create what's called a psychologically safe environment. And there's a Harvard business professor here, her name is Amy Edmondson, who's done a ton of research over the last 2 decades on psychological safety. And she has this great quote as well, which I'm going to read, which I think sums it up extremely well, and hopefully will resonate with a bunch of you. And it turns out that no one wakes up in the morning, jumps out of bed and says, I can't wait to get to work today, to look ignorant, incompetent, intrusive, or negative. On average, we prefer to look smart, helpful, and positive. The good news about all this is it's very easy to manage. If you don't want to look incompetent, if you want to look ignorant, don't ask any questions. If you don't want to look incompetent, don't admit weakness or mistake. If you don't want to look intrusive, don't offer ideas. And if you don't want to look negative, by all means, don't criticize the status quo. So you as a leader, in order to create this safe environment, you have to give people the ability to be human beings. Allow them to say things that might not make sense, but be open to them. Allow them to speak up and share their information. Be vulnerable yourself. Realize, I say to my leaders, you have to get really comfortable with, I'm sorry, I don't know, can you help me? Because then you set the tone for your team to say, you're human too, you don't have all the answers, you don't know everything, we're in this together, we need to work together. You are all great people, you have great brains, and I want to learn from you and have all of us help to make this a better working environment or a better classroom. So let's talk a little bit about that. So let's get a little bit into the brain itself, since this is about neuroscience. Let's talk about the brain. This little organ that's it's about 3 pounds for most of us. It takes up 20% of our energy in the day. So it's very greedy and hungry for information, for energy. That's why we sleep and that's why we eat and all these things. It's really mostly to feed our brain more than anything else. And the brain does a couple of things. It, as I mentioned earlier, it seeks reward or it avoids threat. And it does this about 5 times a second, according to some research that I've read. So every 5 times every second, your brain's going, what's going on? Is it safe? Is that person a threat? Are they a friend or a foe? It's constantly doing this on a regular basis. So it's trying to go for happiness or reward, and it's trying to stay away from threat. Now, what's interesting about this, and you can see the different sizes of the faces as it comes up, is our brain focuses much more on threat than it does on reward. So it's about a 2 times difference. I read a study recently where a bunch of people were asked, if you were at risk of winning $100, what would cause you to want to put that at risk? How much would you need to win to risk $100? And the average came in about $260. So that's 2.6 times. So we have what's called a negativity bias. And especially if we don't have information, if something is unknown, we generally assume the worst as opposed to assuming the best. Because our brain is trying to protect us. The reason it does this is because the reason we're all here is that our ancestors survived, and they survived because they avoided threat a lot more than they got reward. They didn't risk as much, so their genes were passed on, and that's how our brain evolved. So that's the one we got. And our brain that sits in our head, according to many, is about 12,000 years old. So it hasn't really changed much in quite a long time, 600 generations, give or take. What's also interesting is you can see there's the brain, because it's 12,000 years old, does not easily distinguish between a physical threat, where someone is physically threatening you, and a social threat. It acts generally the same way. And I have a story that happened to me. So I'm a certified coach. In order to get certified, I had to stand in front of a bunch of other certified coaches, and they quizzed me for what was supposed to be about an hour. And in order to do that, I had to go to training. And in one of the training sessions, first time I'd ever been exposed to all this, I was asked to present some information. And I studied and I worked hard and I did all these wonderful things. I didn't know enough about the brain yet to do a good job. And when I went up to do my presentation, which was only 5 minutes long, I looked at the slides, and they weren't exactly the same slides that I was given to practice on. And I started to freak out, basically. My vision got very tunnel, so I couldn't really see anyone. I started to sweat like crazy, and I couldn't really hear myself speak. I knew I was talking, but I couldn't really hear myself. I don't know if anyone's had that situation. So I was in full threat mode. My brain was saying, run from the room, get out of here. I got through it because I had memorized it so well. I just sort of stumbled through it. But that's a really good example of the brain not really understanding that, I wasn't going to get hurt. It was a bunch of nice people. They were smiling at me, and many of them are my friends now. But that's what happens in the brain. So as a leader, it's really important to understand that the brain is always thinking towards this threat reward thing. It's wants more reward and less threat. So let's talk a little bit about that. There's a great model. My talk is called Neuroleadership, and there's an organization that I'm associated with. It's one of my certifications, called the Neuroleadership Institute. It's in New York City. You can look it up online. It's got some great content. They push a lot of stuff out. And they're about learning and feedback and growth and all these wonderful things relative to the brain. And they have a model that they've been working on for about 10, 12 years called SCARF. And that stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And I'm going to do each one individually. But this is what your brain is doing. This is the social aspect of your brain. Your brain it wants more status, more certainty, more autonomy, more related, and more fairness, and less of those things as well, as often as possible. So let's go one at a time. Status. Status is your relative importance to others. So if you're the leader, then your status is already different from everyone else. So you have to work really hard to try to lessen that gap. They're already going to see you as different from them. So that's one thing you want to do. You want to move them towards a situation where you're not inadvertently creating a more status relationship. So if you have an office and if you bring people back to your office to reprimand them or correct them or coach them, that's your office is a status symbol. And if you want to have less status, you can maybe bring them to your office, but don't sit behind your desk. talk to them face to face, or maybe go outside and go for a walk, where you're creating less of a status situation. Because again, your brain understands this and starts to put them in a slight threat mode. The next thing is certainty. Our brain really hates uncertainty, and it will make up reasons if it hoards a vacuum, as they say. So if there's something unknown, it'll make up reasons. And since we have a negativity bias, it'll very likely make up bad reasons. So you want to give your team the ability to predict the future as much as you can. I'm a big fan of give them direction, not instruction. So tell them, here's where we're going. Here's what we're doing. Here's how you can help, or let's do that. And let's figure out the path that you need to go, and let me help you along that path. That gives them some certainty as well. And it also gives them the next one, which is autonomy. You give them some sort of ability to make their own decisions based upon, of course, some guidelines that you're going to set as a leader. But you give them a sense of control over events. There's so much out of our control, especially today. The more autonomy you can give to your team, the better they will be in terms of productivity and engagement, a number of other things. The next thing is relatedness. We all hate to be in the out group. In the out group, if you think back sort of from our ancestors, the out group was really bad. If you were not in the in group, very likely you were not going to survive. If for some reason you had something happen to you, or you wronged someone in the group, you were ostracized. And if you were ostracized 10,000 years ago, you didn't survive. So your genes were not passed on. So our brain knows, stay in the in group whenever you can do. And if you're in the out group, that's a threat, and it acts accordingly. So you got to give them a sense of connection. Let them know that we're in this together. We're a team. A team is a group of people who share roles and responsibilities. We we celebrate the rewards, but we also shoulder the burdens and the losses together. And then we figure out how to make it better next time as a group. As often as you can do that, that's really helpful in terms of neuroleadership. The last, is fairness. And I'm trying to read your comments as you go, but it's really hard, sorry. And this is, we all have this. I call it a fairness gene. Probably, I don't know if we have a fairness gene, but we don't like unfairness. And there's a really well-known study called the ultimatum game, which some of you may know. It's been around for decades, and it gets the same results every time. The premise is this: there are two people, and one of them is given $10. They can't see each other, and they don't know each other probably, but they don't know who the other person is. And the person who gets the $10 can give any amount of it to the other person. The other person, when they receive it, has two choices. They can accept the money, and then both parties will get paid, if you will get the money that each was designated, or they can reject it. Now, if we're all rational human beings, if you're in this situation, if you get any money, it's more than you had going into the room, right? But that's not what happens. Most of the time, if you get an amount of money that you don't think is fair, you will give up your money to let the other person know that they're not being fair. And I think the average is, if you give $3 or more, then it's much more likely to be accepted by the other person. We sort of think, which is interesting. It's not 50-50, although 50-50 is certainly a good one, but we'll accept a little less, but we want to make sure it's fair. So that's really important. And as you know, if you're in a classroom, kids will always say, that's not fair. And you'll know that they're triggering something in their brain, which will actually affect their ability to learn and pay attention to you and be productive. So that's really important. So SCARF is a really good model. So let's review a little bit. So we talked about the 3 threat levels: the broader environment, the neighborhood, and then upon you. Then we have positive strategies to affect that, which are certainty, autonomy, and community. And then I love sublime is a great word. Sublime questions, really insightful questions. If you can ask a really great question, you're really helping out your team, your students, whatever it is. And then, of course, you have to create this environment for the best, most productivity engagement or learning. And that's a psychologically safe environment. And that's around status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, which I just discussed. Okay, so let's go back to the second question. Hopefully I've given you some time to think about it, and I'm actually going to take a drink of water. So I want you to think about, in that mind, how that process went for you to get to mastery. So for me, my story here is juggling. When I was a kid, I wanted to juggle. I don't know why, probably I wanted to show off or something. I was like 9 or 10 or something. So I wanted to figure out how to do that. And what I did was I got batteries, these heavier batteries, D batteries, and I went to the stairs that were in our house that were carpeted, and I just practiced, and I did one at a time, and I sort of really slowly, and threw one up in the air and I caught it, and I threw the up in the air and I caught it, and then I threw one in the other and I caught them together, and then I just sort of moved on, and over time, I learned how to juggle, and I can juggle now. I can juggle 3 things. I can't juggle 4. I haven't done it in a while, so I'm not gonna show you right now. I don't have my batteries nearby. But I went through this process in order to get to mastery, and I was pretty good. I could go pretty fast. I could go in different directions, all those kinds of things. But that was a process that took place over a period of time. And there's a model that I want to share with you, which is called ages. And this is how the brain learns. Again, the brain doesn't learn. I don't know how you guys work in your world, but when I was taught, I sat in a classroom, and a teacher, in essence, thought I was a vessel and to fill me up with information. And my job was to somehow figure it out, absorb it, retain it, and then spit it back at some point, recall it for them on a test or a question or whatever it was. But that's not the optimal way to learn something. And ages is a great metaphor or acronym for attention, generation, emotions, and spacing. And you'll see this little hippocampus thing in the middle there. And the hippocampus is basically kind of a traffic cop in your brain. We're getting tons and tons of information right now. Just listening to me, you're getting bombarded with information, colors and smells and all this stuff, my voice. And your brain is deciding, what should I pay attention to? What should I shouldn't? What should I not? And your hippocampus is mostly doing that. So I'm sitting here, I've got lights on either side of me and one in front of me. I can hear my wife in the kitchen doing some stuff. I can hear the dog scratching at the door. There's all this stuff, and my brain's saying, ignore that, because be focused on the thing that you're doing here. And that's your hippocampus doing that. So let's talk about ages a little bit. So let me explain it. So let's do attention. Attention is really, really important. As you know, if you're a teacher or you're a leader, especially a teacher, when you're first starting your class, you have about 90 seconds to get their attention. And you have it for about 10 minutes. And then you have to get it again. And then you'll have it for another 10 minutes. If you keep doing that over and over, eventually you don't have to do it every 10 minutes, you start to get them. But that's because the brain starts to lose focus and attention, especially with all these distractions in the world that we're in today, be it COVID or racism or just even phones and other distractions, noise in the hallway, whatever it might be. The brain, when the brain says, when we focus on this thing, it knows that this is important and I have to pay attention to this. This has consequence. It matters. So if you can create a situation that it matters, and I did this already, I don't know if you noticed, but at the beginning, I asked you a question which said, if you could know the few critical things that would ultimately accelerate joyful learning, what would it mean to you? I asked you to put some attention and focus and consequence to this discussion so you could make it meaningful for you. Because what I'm talking, you don't really care what I'm saying. You care what I'm saying means to you. Is Bill going to help me in some way? So that was one question. I do that all the time when I do my talks. I always say at the beginning, hey, at the end of this, I'm going to teach you about this. If I was successful and I did that, what would it mean to you? And I make them write it down like I did with you, and they have it in front of them so they can connect with me. Hopefully they paid more attention. Now, the second thing is generation. And this is really interesting. Generation is about meaning. And what that means is you have to, as I just mentioned, you have to have it mean something to you. I did a little bit of generation early on. Hopefully some of you wrote it down and it's following you through this talk. The other thing about generation is connections. And what I mean by connections in your brain. The things that we can absorb and retain and recall often have a lot of different connections. So like the word apple. The word apple has so many connections in your brain. It has, of course, that it's a fruit, that it's tasty. It has a crunchy sound. Maybe you associate it with apple pie, which you associate with someone in your family who would make apple pie or some other apple dessert, which reminds you of that person who you love, and all these connections. So you can easily remember apple very well. But if I throw out a word like orthogonal, which you may or may not know, you don't have anything to connect it to. So you might remember it because it was weird, but over time you'll probably forget. Or you probably forget the definition of orthogonal. Actually, once in a while I have to look it up because I don't use it very often, and I forget the definition too. But it basically just means perpendicular, right? It's not on a parallel space. Emotion. Emotion is really important in learning. When we have some sort of emotion connected to what we do, and that could be a negative emotion. If you go back and things that you remember really well, or you think you remember really well, there was probably some heightened emotion. Often it's a negative emotion, but it also can be a positive emotion. So, and that creates anticipation, because emotions play this dual role in learning. They can actually increase our attention. So if you help people do something that's more emotional, it'll increase the intention, but it'll also, it helps focus as well. And then it creates a sense of anticipation if it's sort of joyful. And people want to do it again, they're going to remember it, because your brain says, of course, to you, hey, if this is a negative thing, I want to avoid it. It's really important to remember this so we don't do it again, or we recognize it next time and we go away from it or deal with it. But also if it's positive, we want to do more of it. So it's probably pretty important to remember that. If there's a berry or if there's some sort of food out there, remember thinking back 10,000 years, that was really yummy and felt good, we want to remember that that's a good thing to eat. And next time we see it when we're out walking or doing whatever, we want to pick that berry, either eat it now or bring it back to the tribe, right? So again, this is how your brain is working inside your head. And then lastly, spacing. Spacing is really important. And what I have found with spacing is that, the example I have, so I'm checking the time, I want to make sure I'm on track, is the example I have is, so when I was studying to be a certified coach, I had to memorize all this stuff. And I was, as I mentioned, had to be quizzed. And the first time I did it, I failed. I didn't make it. They said, you know what, you don't really know it well enough. And part of it was because I didn't really buy into the whole certification thing and having to memorize it. I didn't think that was really what coaching was. So I didn't have a lot of attention, a lot of focus. It didn't feel good to me. So probably didn't have a lot of motivation, but I wanted to get certified. I just wanted to have that little title next to me so people would say, okay, at least he did something and he might know something. So what I did is I chatted with some of my friends and I bought a bunch of 3x5 index cards. And I wrote down these things, and I had 100 and something cards. There were so many cards. And what I did is I went through them and I quizzed myself. And I had the question on one side, and then I would flip it over and you could see the answer. And so I'd read the question and I had to think to myself, what was the answer? And then I'd check the answer. And if I got it right, I put it in one pile. If I got it wrong, I put it in another pile. And then if I wasn't really good at it, I put it in a middle pile. And then all the ones that were in the pile where I got it right, I left them alone and I pushed the other ones together. And then I figured out what I didn't know. And I went back and I studied and I tried to figure out other ways to learn it. And then I quizzed myself again until they were all in the pile that I knew everything. And then I waited about a week or so, it wasn't really a week, a little less than a week. And I quizzed myself again. And guess what? I forgot stuff. So I did the process again. I kept doing that until I think it was 3 times in a row that I did all the cards exactly right. And then when I was certified the second time, which was about a month or so later, I was told by the person who'd been certifying people for about 10 years that I was the fastest tester he'd ever seen. I did the hour in 37 minutes because I had it, it was so in my brain. Now I've forgotten it since then because I haven't gone back to that. But that's a wonderful thing. And if you think about it, it's back to that juggling thing, right? It was over time. There's a lot of repetition, etc. And I was teaching my brain and my hands how to move. So this model of ages of attention, which is about focus and consequence, generation, which is about meaning, connections, and significance and anticipation for emotion, and then spacing for retrieval and repetition. This is how the brain actually works. Self-quizzing is a wonderful thing. As a teacher or a leader, if you want people to be able to remember something, make them quiz themselves and write down the answers and then check it. You'll actually learn it faster. There's been a lot of research that this process isn't any longer than what we do today, but it has much better results. So I highly recommend that. And I'll have some books for you at the end as well to look up. for this. So let's do a quick review again. We did the 3 threat levels, talked about positive strategies, the beauty of questions, psychological safety to create this environment of learning, and then of course, understanding how the brain learns itself, and keep that in the back of your mind. So I'm going to end up here, but there's one more story I want to tell about this in terms of psychological safety. So, and this may have happened to many of us, is that, have you ever been in a situation where you're in a meeting with a bunch of people, and maybe you were running the meeting and your boss was in the meeting as well. And maybe he, at the end of the meeting, he sort of tapped you on the shoulder and said, Bill, I want to talk about this meeting. Can you follow me back to my office so we can talk about it? And the first thing that goes through your brain is, what did I do wrong, right? Because we have a negativity bias. And then you're thinking, okay, what did I do wrong? You're thinking, what did you do wrong? All right, am I going to get fired, or am I going to, something bad going to happen to me? Well, if I get fired, then, we're not going to be able to do that thing we want to do as a family. For me, I have kids in college, and am I going to be before college? So all of these things are going through your head. But by the time you sit down with your boss, you're in full threat mode, because he triggered SCARF. He triggered status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, right? Let me bring it back to that. So he triggered, bring him back to my office, his office, he's the boss. You don't have any idea what you're talking about. You potentially don't have any control over this. You're in the out group because he's telling you to come back to his office, and you're not really sure if it's fair. So the other thing that you could do instead, if you're the boss, is say, hey, Bill, that was a pretty good meeting. What I'd like to do is, let's work together to make it even better. So why don't you put like lunch or maybe a cup of coffee or something on my schedule in the next week or two, and we can talk about it. What I'd like you to do is, could you come to the meeting with a few things you thought went really well, maybe 1 or 2 things that you think we should improve on to make it even better. I'll do the same thing, and then we'll work together to get this thing to be better. It might take us 2 or 3 times to do it, but let's try to make this the best possible meeting we can. Your results hopefully will be the same, but it's a completely different approach. And this person feels like they're part of it. There's no status, right? You're not going back to the office, right? There's certainty, you know exactly what it is, and you have control over it because you're bringing your own ideas. You're saying, hey, we're both in the same group, we're in this together, and this seems like fair to you. We do this inadvertently, right? I don't know how many, I've done it when I was with boss, hey, can you get back to my office? I want to chat with this, because you wanted to separate them from the group. You maybe want to give them a little correction. You didn't want to do it in front of anybody, but that's what you're triggering in the brain. And that may be why you're frustrated. All right, so let's end this because I think I'm at time. So the things I would like you to think about is, as I mentioned, the resources, the Neuroleadership Institute. Again, that's just neuroleadershipinstitute.com. A number of things that I talked about today were at Your Brain at Work by Dr. David Rock. It's a book you can have. The thing I talked about with 90 seconds and attention was from a book called Brain Rules by Dr. John Medina, who's a biologist and neurobiologist. And then, of course, there's my book. You can go in a lot more depth in that. So if you teach with the brain in mind, you'll be able to have better outcomes. You'll have a happier team. You'll have happier students. They'll learn things faster. You'll be more productive and more engaged. And so for my book, at the bottom is Catalyst Growth Advisors. It's on Amazon and iTunes, but if you just want to download it, it's free on my site. Just go to my site and you can download the PDF. So Tammy, I can see you up there on my screen, and I'm all done. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. Bill, while you were speaking, there were a lot of positive feedback on the live stream. People are saying, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So many comments, but I have questions now. And there are 2 questions here. The first question that someone asked is, you said that emotions are important to learning. How can we leverage that to get teaching and learning to an optimal level? How can we leverage emotions to get to an optimal level?
Yeah, one of the key things within emotion is sort of this social pressure thing is what it's called. So it's actually a little bit of a negative emotion because you sort of feel like you don't want to let your other teammates down or other students down. That's why study groups, we always say you should study in a group because there's this extra pressure. It creates that emotion. So if you as a leader create teams or sub-teams and say, hey, we need to solve this problem. Why don't you 3 go ahead and do that, or you 3 students work together on this problem, that can help create this emotion. The other thing is you can associate joy to it and fun. And, you talked earlier about let's dance and whatever, right? My daughter went to a Waldorf school, which is an international school, and it's all about kinesthetic learning. It's about incorporating the body and the mind, which actually helps the brain. So you can do those things as well.
Okay, so the second question here is, what's required for one to have a professional training in neurology? I think this person wants to have a training in neurology and would like to know what's required.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you can certainly go to school and study to be a neuroscientist, which will take you many, many, many years. But there are lots of organizations that talk about, they're science-based, evidence-based. Again, I recommend the Neuroleadership Institute. They have a number of levels of courses. There are certainly books that you can read. I've studied neuroscience on my own. I've read dozens and dozens of books. I write about it all the time. And then I took this certification class. So if there's one thing I'd say is go to the Neuroleadership Institute. They put out content all the time. So you can just listen and read and do that. They also have classes that you can do. You don't have to actually be in New York to do the class. You can do it offline, which is what I did. The class I took was completely offline. I did it all myself, self-instructed. It's expensive, but you can certainly do it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bill. I think your session has spurred a lot of people to get interested in neuroscience. So this is something that we want to read more, find materials online. And thank you for letting us know that your materials are available also so that we can read through them. Thank you so much for this session.
My pleasure. Again, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for everyone. Thank you for all the wonderful comments. I saw them flying by as I was speaking. I look forward to reading them.
Thank you, Bill. All right. Have a great day, Bill. Bye.
You too. Thank you, everyone.
All right.
Good.